Hi, my name is Chris, and I want to teach you how to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This video will focus more on how chaining cards together works. I'm going to be talking a lot about Magic the Gathering for this section, so you're just going to have to deal with it. I promise I'm doing my best to make everything make sense. So, chains are the system in Yu-Gi-Oh! That determine when and how cards resolve when activated in sequence to one another, kind of like the stack in Magic. However, Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have a priority system, at least not in the same way as Magic the Gathering. When building a chain, your opponent automatically has the ability to respond to the card you played. Your opponent also automatically has priority when you try to move to the next step or phase. All that priority ensures in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the traditional sense is that you have the first opportunity to use a card or effect in an open game state on your turn. In theory, this means your opponent has significantly more control over your turn than you do, and in certain situations that is true. If you are going second and your opponent has set up an incredibly powerful board with multiple layers of disruption, they have way more options and opportunities to interact with you on your turn. It is very difficult to establish yourself in that kind of game unless your first game action drastically influences the board. This does open the opportunity in the card design space for cards that are only applicable in these types of scenarios, but the general consensus on this may vary. The distinct lack of priority in Yu-Gi-Oh! Influences a lot about how players plan out their turns and how cards can be interacted with. Let's use a more direct comparison to Magic the Gathering. Chains and the stack work fairly similarly. When you activate a card or effect, your opponent gets a chance to respond with their own card or effect. You can then respond to that card and so on and so forth. Then you resolve the most recent thing you've done and go down the line accounting for any changes that have been made by card effects. The individual effects that go onto the stack in this way are referred to as chain links, and certain cards might have restrictions or effects based on how far along they are in a chain. This at one point created a deck known as Chain Burn, which ideally would build as long of a chain as possible to kill the opponent. If multiple effects trigger and would start a chain at the same time, the turn player chains their effects together first, then passes priority to their opponent. Some triggers in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are mandatory, so those have to start the chain no matter who the turn player is, but these are generally few and far between. This is where a lot of the similarities between the stack and chains end, however. Once players stop activating cards and effects and a chain starts resolving, it cannot be interacted with past that point. This is a little confusing, but I think it can be best explained with the analogy of actual stacks and chains. When you're stacking stuff on top of each other, it's very easy to take stuff off and put others back on. But have you ever tried to take apart chain links or build chain with metal? You would have to break the chain in order to add anything to it, which can't really be done in Yu-Gi-Oh! Once you build a chain, it is considered one whole object that moves together, and when you're finished, you'll just have to start a new one. These rulings, incidentally, make it much harder to craft infinite loops in the same way you can in Magic the Gathering. The lack of priority and the lack of versatility also means that it is much harder to respond to your opponent's interaction. When you are interrupted in your plays, it is very definitive and has a tangible impact on the game because many cards are locked to having once per turn effects. But all of this can be flipped on its head to benefit you too. Your interaction is stronger and has more of an impact on your opponent. That isn't to say that removal and interaction is stronger in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or that chains are better, because frankly, they're not. It just means that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot stricter with how you interact with your opponent, which always seems to surprise people, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the game where you go all over the place. One thing that I don't want to misconstrue in my explanation of all this is that the game is hard. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a difficult game to learn looking at its rule system. But I also personally think that just explaining rules in card games with specific wording is difficult. I've been explaining Yu-Gi-Oh! In relation to Magic the Gathering because they do have sort of similar systems, with Yu-Gi-Oh! Being more of a derivative. But I think both games have an aspect of the rules of how cards interact with each other being difficult. Card games that have instant speed cards or triggers that happen at specific points need a way to sequence activations and simultaneous effects to each other. Otherwise, the game feels less like you are interacting with another player and that things are just happening and you have to deal with them. Any sort of system that involves cards interacting with each other in this way will always come with a variety of rules questions and complications and a lot of difficult challenges. A lot of this concerns itself with the topic of problem-solving card text and how cards are written and worded in a way to indicate how they interact with each other. And I don't know exactly what the nature of a video like that would be if I made one on that topic, but I don't want any sort of confusion on the difficulty of the game. I personally don't think it's that bad, but that's only because I've grown up with it, and in changing over to a game like Magic, a lot of decisions in each game feel sort of opposite to each other, but they still come from the same root, if that makes sense. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a very high floor on what is required to know how to play the game, but it has a much lower ceiling on how cards can interact with each other than other games. So if you can get over the initial learning curve of Yu-Gi-Oh!, playing the game isn't as overwhelming as most people think. Thank you for watching and listening. If this video helped you out in any way, make sure to tell me about it below. I definitely want to make more of these, so if you're interested, like and subscribe.